Well, yeah. Maybe we can.
Yeah, thank you.
You have a comment? Yeah. Yeah, for request from students.
Oh, okay. Just.
The last year, but not as trained as this time. I'm getting this time. Walking around.
I don't know what.
So she's doing your best.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. Okay. This is going to.
Well, welcome. Good morning. Welcome to the last seminar of this academic year, and also it's also very, very special last one, because as a department chair, this is my last chance hosting another peer chairs from other universities. And by July 1st, Professor Paul Scheider is going to be our new chair. I done my service and happy to pass the baton. So therefore it's very, very special today. And so I forgot my name. My name is Ed Guo, and the BME department chair for a couple of months, and at Columbia University. So before I introducing our speaker, I have a few instructions to give. Today we continue offer this lecture in hybrid format with both virtual and live audience. Our speaker will present approximately 40 to 45 minutes, and we leave about 15 minutes at the end for question and answers. For our virtual audience, throughout the presentation, please use in Q&A features at the bottom of your screen, not the chat, but if you do not know that, I think where have you been for past 3 years in the COVID? We'll try to answer as many questions as possible during these Q&A sessions at the end. For our live audience, you have a chance to ask a question as well. So, as I said, this is really truly my honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Zoran Nenadic, who received a Doctor of Science degree in System Science and Mathematics from the Washington University in St. Louis. After holding a postdoc scholar position at Caltech, he subsequently joined the BME department at UC Irvine, where he's currently professor and William Link department chair. His research interests are in neuroengineering, with focus on technologies to restore functions lost during the neurological injuries. He has received many research awards, including NSF Career Award and Hiroman Wagner Award from Japan, and High-10 Scholarship from China. And his research has been featured in numerous media outlets, including Time Magazine, Reuters, and Fox Business News. Okay, and let's give a welcome to Professor Nenadic. This one.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Guo for this kind introduction and for his hospitality. We had a lot of fun last night. And also thank you for those of you who made the time to join my presentation today. I will be talking about brain-computer interfaces for human gait restoration. And so to start us off, I'm going to provide several motivating points. So spinal cord injury and stroke can lead to loss of function and leg sensation. So we're looking at the lower extremities. There's a profoundly negative impact on independence and quality of life in those who are affected by these conditions. They also tend to lead sedentary lifestyle, which means that oftentimes they're confined to a wheelchair, which can lead to loss of sensation and many other comorbidities. And it's actually these comorbidities that are the primary driver of the healthcare costs in somebody who suffers from spinal cord injury or stroke. So much so that the combined cost of these two diseases on a per annual basis in the US alone is estimated to be about $80 billion. That includes both primary and secondary healthcare costs. And that's something that as an engineer, you learn quickly where the pain points are. And so currently there are no biomedical solutions that are capable of restoring motor and sensory functions after these conditions. And therefore, clinically practical and socially acceptable solutions are needed for these conditions. So what might be some of those novel approaches to spinal cord injury or stroke? Brain-computer interface is certainly one such approach, and you'll hear more about it today. There's other things, cell-based therapy, aka stem cells. Many of you are familiar with this, and this department is very well known for work. I should also say that Professor Saida is also one of my role models when it comes to BCIs, speaking of this great department. So there's currently clinical trials for safety in acute spinal cord injury, and I think it's safe to say that we are still years, if not decades away before these therapies lead to any measurable improvement, which doesn't mean that they shouldn't be pursued. There's also neuromodulation-based approaches that are showing some early promise, even in motor complete spinal cord injury. And so where does BCI fit in this sort of landscape? Well, it has a unique feature. It is really the only technology that allows you to kind of peek into the human brain as they are undergoing neurorestoration, neurorehabilitation, training, and so on and so forth. And it allows sort of real-time access to these signals. So I would argue then that BCIs are complementary to either existing, classical approaches to therapies or to these new alternative techniques. And therefore, in my opinion, they're going to continue to play a prominent role in neurorestoration, either as a standalone technology or adjunct technology to these other methods that are out there. So here's a little bit of a application landscape, application pyramid, if you will. So on the base, you have sort of the population size, and then on the vertical axis, the level of impairment, if you will. So at the very top of this pyramid, you have those who are most severely paralyzed due to conditions such as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or various types of subcortical strokes can leave the affected individual in this sort of locked-in state where literally you lose every connection to every other muscle in your body. And at some point, the only way to communicate is really just a little bit of eye movement. And ultimately, even that goes away. So for those people at the very top of the pyramid, BCIs could be helpful in restoring the ability to communicate with their loved ones. Fortunately, it is a small population, so you could be helping very few people, but for them, the change could be life-saving, so much so that some of them have been known to decline end-of-life care on the account of being able to communicate and maybe prolong their life by months to several years. And then as you go down, the level of disability reduces. So you're looking at cervical spinal cord injury. Those are people with tetraplegia, typically no arm movements, no movements below the neck, the level of neck. For them, this could be used for wheelchair control or arm prosthesis. And then moving down, you see thoracic or lumbar SCI, where BCIs would be used presumably to restore some of the walking function. And I'll talk more about this. Bowel and bladder function restoration, sexual dysfunction restoration. And then, of course, there is stroke and incomplete SCI. Now the pyramid gets bigger and bigger because the disease gets bigger as well. And then finally, able-bodied individuals, typically video gamers, they're always interested in increasing the number of actions per second. So if you can give them another channel to communicate, they'll take it. So there's also some other things like cognitive load assessment, neurofeedback, and so on and so forth. So where do I fit in? We kind of work in this middle area. We've looked at both thoracic spinal cord injury as well as stroke, and haven't looked at incomplete SCI. The top three are we see BCI as sort of prosthesis tool, where you really use the system to operate some kind of prosthesis, whether it's a robotic arm or muscle stimulator. And then in the bottom, you see BCI as part of neurorehab, which means the system gets in the loop, the person gets better over time thanks to this technology, and then BCI gets removed from the loop, and person presumably regains some of their native function back. So that's an important distinction. So many years ago, before some of you were, maybe some of you were like in primary school, I would say maybe even kindergarten. So I actually was fortunate to start working with clinicians. I was doing a lot of data analysis, developing algorithms and techniques for EEG analysis offline. And then I was fortunate enough to hook up with neurologists, people who actually see patients. And so we started working together. And one of the first BCI systems that we built was really to target restoration of leg function after spinal cord injury. And back then, BCIs were already used, but I don't think there were many groups looking specifically at the leg function. Most of the work was done sort of communication systems for those in locked-in state, maybe upper extremity prosthesis. There was very little, if anything, sort of on the front of the lower extremity. So we built these systems, and so in doing so, we had certain design specs. As engineers, obviously, we like to put a little bit of thought when it comes to. Oh, absolutely. All right.
That should go away.
Thank you so much. So what are the design specs? Well, we wanted this to be intuitive. We wanted to work robustly, and we wanted to have a very short training time. Back then, there were already BCI systems that actually required a subject to spend months just training how to operate this system. And we thought that it wouldn't be practical or wouldn't be widely accepted by those who are supposed to use the system. So we have a very short training time, with a little help of, what today is known as machine learning. Back then, we call it pattern recognition. So anyway, so we made it intuitive. Subjects were simply asked to use kinesthetic motor imagery. That is mental rehearsal of their own motor action. So you literally imagine your own limbs being moved in space. This is an accepted techniques in rehabilitation. Many individuals with spinal cord injury will know how to do this, to imagine their own limbs being moved. It's also used for athletes. So the late Kobe Bryant apparently would practice mentally his moves before important games. So it creates these strong brain signatures of movement intentions. And so we simply ask them to use imagery to move and to revert back to relaxation state when they no longer want to move. We use these information theoretic machine learning decoders that we built to make this work robustly despite subject to subject or day-to-day variations in brain waves. And it was very quick to use. It required only 10 minutes of pre-recorded EEG data followed by short calibration session, and that was it. And many subjects were able to assume purposeful control on the very first day, despite having no experience with the system. So I'll show you some videos now. All right, so here's one of our participants. he actually had tetraplegia. So he was paralyzed from the neck down, very heavily paralyzed. In fact, he doesn't even breathe on his own. So the little black strap that you see going around his head is actually holding a ventilator. So he's actually ventilated, cannot breathe on his own. And so the goal of the game is really, he's the character walking the field. So what he's doing now, he's thinking about walking. And the goal is to walk the avatar forward and then make these designated stops. There's 10 non-player characters. For those of you who are video gamers, you will recognize the video game. I am not, but some of my students are. And so they're supposed to dwell here for a couple of seconds and then move on. And then we sort of score them based on how quickly they finish the game and whether they make all the 10 stops. You should realize that we are decoding continuously. So at about 4 times per second, we are updating the decoder. So the fact that the character is moving forward uninterruptedly means that we are correctly getting all of these decisions in succession. And that's a tall order. For those of you who are doing a little bit of machine learning, you pretty much have to operate at 90, 95, 96% correct to achieve something like this. What's also interesting, when he goes online, when the loop is closed, feedback, he plays this game very well. As you can see, when we do sort of offline analysis, the predicted performance is nowhere near what you see here. So there's a little bit of boost in performance, if you will, once the feedback is closed. So in machine learning, we oftentimes face the opposite problem, where performance during training is higher than when we go in real time. That's called overfitting, right? Here we see a little bit of the opposite effect. So here is a sort of small population, hired 5 individuals with spinal cord injury. Those are the levels of injury. T means thoracic. The number next to that letter tells you at what level. So most of them are mid-thoracic. Asia is a classification of impairment scale. Asia A means no motor or sensory function. And the subject you saw in the previous video was number 3. So it was a different condition. C5 means cervical spinal cord injury. Different age distribution, different time since injury. Most of them learned BCI on the very first day. And then when they repeated this, of course, we did this more than once, several days, several visits, several times. On their best day, they're achieving pretty good performance, definitely about 4 minutes or less than 5 minutes to complete the game. If you play with a joystick, you see down there, it's about 3.5 minutes, obviously. Better or faster. And then some of them were able to hit all 10 cones without making any error. Hence, there's 0 standard deviation, which was really surprising and certainly encouraging. And you see here, it's not perfect. There's always a false positive, false negative here and there. So it's not operating at 100%. So, but this is important. We can achieve very, very good performance. So now, interestingly, when we look at those information theoretic feature extraction maps, if you will, in sort of space and frequency, we see that what lights up here, you don't really need to know anything about this image other than dark blue and dark red are important areas. Okay, so basically this method kind of spits out which frequencies and which areas are important to encode or decode between these 2 states. And you see that this area around the center of the head, electrode CZ and CPZ, is really where the leg motor cortex is. So if you knew nothing about the brain, if brain was just a complete black box, you would actually learn where the information is coming from just by analyzing these short snippets of data. What you see at the bottom is a little bit of arm, sort of bilateral area. And again, this is not surprising because as you imagine yourself walking, there's always arm swing because it's part of our gait. Nobody walks with their, hands sort of still. So this is, perhaps not surprising, but the take-home message here is that these information theoretic extraction map can be visualized, and then these states turned out to be encoded by anatomically and physiologically correct areas and correct frequency bands. And so this is all data-driven. No other instruction was provided here other than learn to separate the 2 states, yet the results are very anatomically plausible. And there is significant subject to subject and day-to-day variations, which is again not surprising given how short these data snippets are. So Perhaps if he had more time, if he collected more data, these models would have been much more stable. They do tend to show a little bit of variability because of our greedy approach, I guess you could say. So conclusions, these motor areas can be reactivated. Keep in mind, for some of these individuals, these areas have been dormant for 10 years. They haven't been used. And so definitely they're not going away. They can be awakened, if you will, by asking individuals to participate in BCI control. BCI naive subjects, those who had no experience, were able to attain purposeful control after really minutes of training. Again, contrast this with months of training that was basically done at the time. The control is very intuitive. So in order to walk, you simply imagine your limbs being moved, your legs. And when you don't want to walk, you sort of relax. Again, back then, there were many systems where people were asked to do mental math, to add numbers to go forward, protrude their tongue to turn left. That is kind of not intuitive and perhaps will not be accepted by the users. So this is kind of organic. You're really trying to restore the function that was lost. And to do so, we actually have to engage the correct cortical resources, at least we think. And then finally, these information theoretic decoders were able to accommodate subject to subject and day-to-day variations to achieve robust performance. So then, encouraged by these results, we wanted to go beyond the virtual reality environment and wanted to integrate our system with the physical prosthesis. So here you see a robot that is mostly used for a stroke rehabilitation. It is sort of suspended over a treadmill. I'll show you a video in just a moment, but I want to highlight a few important differences here. So here, when we go and try to operate this system, we are now in a more natural stance, which is upright stance, right? Nobody walks while being seated. So you could argue that that is not a natural condition for that type of action. So feedback is no longer just visual. So now your whole body is being moved. Actually, your legs are being moved. With those who lack sensation, maybe this is not a big reward because they don't really feel it, but maybe they do, so it's not really clear. I believe that this feedback signal is much stronger and much more rewarding because if you cannot feel your legs, at least you feel your whole body being moved. We have to deal with movement artifacts. So once you set this thing in motion, if this is driven by artifacts, it would appear that you should not be able to stop because it's a positive feedback. So we need to kind of rule out those artifacts, and you'll see that that's not what happens. But otherwise, the procedure is same. Very short training, data collection, where we tag these EEG signals, short calibration, and then we go online. So let's see. So here's a participant with paraplegia, 5 years post-injury, T6 ASIA-B. So you're seeing here his screen is being cloned here. So this is just a copy of his own screen. The video, of course, runs at 4 times the actual speed. Otherwise, it's a 5 minute of not very interesting footage, right? So he now receives a cue to walk. So he's now thinking about walking, and then his legs are being moved by the robot, suspended over a treadmill. And then at 2 minute mark, the cue is going to change back to idle. And again, he's going to very quickly disengage those walking imagery, and then he's going to idle for 4 minutes. We are decoding here, so we haven't turned off the decoder, by the way. So this is not easy to stand still for 1 minute. And I think you're going to see a false positive towards the end. And again, we are decoding at 4 times per second. So to get a full minute of action correctly decoded, you actually have to take 240 decisions, binary decisions in succession. Again, not very easy to do. Even at 99% accuracy, you're going to see a false positive, false negative every once in a while. And I think you're going to see it now. That's a false positive, but he was able to quickly sort of let go of those thoughts. So, and then we've done this both with spinal cord injury and able-bodied. In fact, everything we do, we first do with able-bodied individuals, aka myself. So I'm always the first one to try the device. Not to brag, but I do very well, better than undergrads. So there seems to be a scale. Undergrads do very poorly, grad students do really well, but then professor tends to tends to do best, you know. Anyway, so you see here sort of the diagram, you know, the cues are sort of given in blue. That's thin means don't walk, fat means, you know, walk, and then the red is the decoded one. You see the very good cross correlation with some delay. And then, you know, as high as 0.8 correlation coefficient, no omissions, and false alarm rate is, it's fairly small, but it's there. When we look at these feature extraction maps, again, we find sort of this broad somatosensory distribution of important areas at correct frequency band. So 10 to 12, that is known as the mu band, when it comes from sort of motor area. Some bilateral distribution, most likely indicative of imagining arm swings. Everything here looks anatomically plausible and physiologically correct from that standpoint. Again, which is interesting because everything is sort of purely data driven. So in conclusions, these findings from the virtual reality environment do transfer to physical prosthesis. In fact, you can argue that the performance is even better. We retain those design specs, intuitiveness, robustness, quick to use, motor areas over the physiologically plausible frequencies are involved. And such an excellent performance sort of warrants the pursuit of BCI controlled overground walking prosthesis, where we would like to move away from the treadmill and see if the person can walk freely across the room. And that's kind of the next study that we did. So to this end, we actually merged our system, integrated our system with the FDA approved functional electrical stimulator system for walking. The system is known as Parastep. And so I know that many of you do know this, but in case somebody doesn't know, your muscles can be activated electrically to the point of exerting force. And so this is called functional electrical stimulation. And this system that you see in the picture is normally operated manually. So there's a button for left step, there's a button for right step. There's a front wheel walker that the person sort of advances. And it takes a little bit of training. The person learns how to lean, you know, and swing their body back and forth. And so we actually had to reverse engineer this controller because we don't want to use buttons and hands. We want to completely control this using EEG-based BCI. And to this purpose, we also had to untether the subject. So normally when you're recording EEG, there's cables coming out of your head, and then you're hooked up to a device that's typically plugged into a wall. So obviously that was not a solution. So we had to use wireless capability of our EEG system to allow this free untethered walking. So here you see sort of the setup. We do a lot of in-house engineering. So the harness is just for safety. It's not necessary, but I work with clinicians, and first thing you learn is that safety is the most important thing. We don't want the subject to fall and trip. And a lot of, you know, as I said, homemade products, including our gyroscopes here. You see here the muscle stimulator, you know, these are just electrode, big pads on quadriceps and tibialis anterior, which is responsible for foot dorsiflexion. This is very strong voltage, by the way, probably up to maybe a couple hundred volts. So this specific individual doesn't have sensation. So this would be very painful for somebody who can sense the signals. So certainly not recommended for those who have, you know, unimpaired sensation. It can lock your knees. It can make you sort of stand. And then there's another pattern that allows you to trigger this triple reflex action that's responsible for walking. So it was only a feasibility study, one subject, but it was a long-term study. So we had him come over for almost 9 months. We had to do screening. Again, it's not safe for somebody who spends years in a wheelchair to just ask them to stand up. So as Dr. Goon knows, there's things such as osteoporosis. You have to screen, so full body DEXA scan. You have to rule against fractures. It is also can be unsafe for somebody who's been paralyzed to stand up because there is orthostatic hypotension. They can faint because of dysregulation, pressure dysregulation. There's also autonomic dysreflexia. So that's why you really need clinicians in your team to set up inclusion-exclusion criteria and to do this screening. FDA also recommends 12 weeks of FES training prior to using this device, which really means put ankle weights, dial up the stimulator and just work out with ankle weights being completely driven by FES. And their muscles do bulk up after 12 weeks. You can see the quads getting bigger. It's really amazing. I actually didn't take full 12 weeks because there was a very good response. So I think we shortened the prep time. But otherwise, it's a short training, 10 minutes. We kept playing this virtual reality game just as a sort of warm-up, if you will. And then on every visit, we perform 1 to 6 overground walking tests. So let's see one of these. Supposed to be a sound here, but it's not important. There's a caption too. So basically, he's now going to be assuming the control of the device himself. So now it's completely driven by BCI. And so he's going to receive some kind of verbal cues from my grad student. She's going to tell him start walking. So now we are still decoding, and he says he's not walking. And so he receives the command, and then he starts walking. You see immediately he looks down at his feet because, again, he has no sensation. So the only way for him to know that where his legs are stepping is to look down. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. And so the goal of the game is just to walk across the room, make a stop here in the middle. So it's a 12-meter distance. No, sorry, it's a 6-meter distance, 12 feet. No, it's a 3-meter distance, 10 feet. All right, so he's standing here in the middle, and then he's gonna be there for maybe 30 seconds, and then she's gonna command for him to start moving again. The physical therapist, the clinician, they're just there to make sure nothing goes wrong. They're not really doing much other than providing support. So, and he's going to finish now the course 12 feet. That's right, 12 feet, 3.66 meters. And you can see a little bit of blood pooling. So his legs are turning sort of purple. So typically what this means is that we would now need to give him a break, maybe half an hour, let him recuperate and try to do another one. So it can easily take a full day. It's very labor intense as well. It takes like 3 or 4 people just to handle the whole thing. So now you can see a little bit better up close the stimulators. So there's a laser rangefinder that tracks his position. The signals are sent wirelessly to a computer that sits against the wall. Then the computer does real-time data crunching, spits out the decision that comes wirelessly. And then it operates this sort of controller that he has in this fanny pack. And then there's a bunch of sensors as well. So you'll see the diagram in the next slide. So as I mentioned, he also kept playing this video game. So this is interesting. Over the course of almost 9 months, 8.5 months, you can see that his completion time kept going down and sort of plateaued, reached something that's just marginally inferior to manually controlled joystick. And then on the flip side, his stop score kept increasing, ultimately reaching 10 out of 10 or close to. So there's definitely some learning going on here as he's performing this over multiple months. So this is one of the online sessions. You see here, the verbal cues is in yellow, so idle walk, and then the decoded state follows closely with some delay. The 2 gyroscopes, you can see the raw data as well as segmented state information. Laser sort of shows the progression. There's obviously some noise, but flat means standing, and straight line with a constant slope means moving at a constant speed. And so this is the average performance over 30 of those online walking tests, very high correlation coefficients, almost 0.8. There is a little bit of lag, and this is a trade-off between precision, how accurate you want your decoder to be, and if you want your decoder to act really fast, then it's going to be much more noisier. And if you want some stability, you have to kind of integrate over larger data segments, which invariably leads to a little bit of a delay. Information transfer rates. So a common way of expressing the performance of a BCI system is to calculate the bit rate, the number of bits per second. So you treat this as a binary communication channel that sends 2 messages out. And so we are routinely exceeding 3 bits per second in this system and also in other systems, which I'm not going to talk about today. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is it was commonly believed back then that the sort of magical bit rate limit for non-invasive BCI was 1 bit per second. But it's clear that practically we can exceed it by a factor of 3 at least. So obviously that is not a correct prediction as far as like what the limits are. There is some false alarms. It's not perfect. There is rarely omissions. I think we didn't see any. So in conclusion, restoration of brain-controlled overground walking after paraplegia is feasible. The high level of performance is maintained across 30 real-time walking tests over a 19-week period. And even better performance could be achieved using invasively recorded brain signals. And so in that regard, we wanted to really build such a system. We're still in the process. We've made a lot of progress. I'd say COVID hasn't been kind to us as far as moving this project forward, but we've done a lot of things. So why invasive? Well, first of all, signal quality is much better. So EEG is very noisy, very artifact prone. We can make it fully implantable, which means there will be no skull protruding components. Everything will be internalized. No external electronics. It will be completely untethered. And then if you use invasive technology, you can not only record from the brain, you can stimulate the brain electrically. And just like the muscle responds to electrical stimulation, your brain will do too, which means you can elicit sensation artificially, right? And then our design assumes that we do most of heavy lifting here in the chest. And there's a cable that connects the front end, which is really just a bunch of amplifiers, serializers, multiplexers with this subcutaneous cable, and then the data is processed here at the unit. Wirelessly, the commands are sent out to some kind of external prosthesis, let's say exoskeleton. And then at the same time, the signals from exoskeleton, maybe pressure sensors, accelerometer data, can be fed back wirelessly to the chest wall unit, which really plays the role of a computer, and then delivered to the sensory cortex where they would elicit sensation. So this kind of works as a fully bidirectional feedback system. For those of you who are familiar with DBS, deep brain stimulator, this is sort of reminiscent of that design. The subtunneling, the tunneling cable that goes subcutaneously is actually common to DBS. Even this chest wall unit is routinely done for these devices, pacemakers, and so on and so forth. So we propose to use electrocorticograms, which is really here contrasted with classical EEG. So EEG would be these green electrodes, and ECOG electrodes are given here in red. So you see where they sit. They sit kind of in the subdural space above the arachnoid and above the pia. So they don't really penetrate the cortical tissue, but they're close enough to achieve, good spatiotemporal resolution, much better, much stronger signals than EEG. So here I've put a table sort of that shows side by side the properties of these signals. So signal quality is superior. They're immune to artifacts, so they won't record blink artifacts, muscle artifacts. These electrodes implanted in the subdural space are long-term stable. So there's already FDA-approved devices where they tested the longevity of these electrodes for the treatment of epilepsy. And they can routinely last upwards of 5 years, even more. And nobody in neurosurgery, nobody likes to do revision surgery every 2 years or even every 5 years. I think the more you can last without a surgery, the better. And these electrodes are FDA approved for recording and stimulation. So we had to confront a lot of challenges here. So first of all, device that will amplify these things at the spot doesn't exist. So we call this component skull unit. So a bunch of amplifier, low power amplifiers. We call it ultra low power analog front end decoding algorithms. We have something working for EEG, but ECO has much higher spatiotemporal resolution. Artificial sensation, how do you elicit movements that are biomimetic? How do you simulate arm swing or foot pressing against the ground, reaction force? Those are all unknown at this point. How do you simultaneously record and stimulate? The moment you start stimulating the cortex, the proximity of these two electrode grids will invariably lead to huge artifacts that will propagate, and they may even saturate the amplifier. And of course, this doesn't exist here, the chest wall unit. It's all low power processing, data transmission, and so on and so forth. I should disclose that while I am doing a lot of this work, this is obviously not one lab's job, so I really need to highlight that, I do have wonderful collaborators. So when you see a slide like this, don't think that I hold all the knowledge here. So there's definitely expertise here that exceeds my own boundaries. So we purchased one of these exoskeletons. We've undergone the training. It's a very cool device coming out of Exobionics. I think the company started at Berkeley. So we built our first generation of custom made amplifier and serializer. We printed these chips. We tested them against commercial systems. We even built the whole chest wall unit prototype made out of off-the-shelf components, ARM processors, memory. We built a custom-made transceiver. We built phantom tissue and tested the function of this transceiver over short distances, which is what we envision this system to need to do. We tested this in a med radio band, which is a specifically allocated band for communication of medical devices. So a lot of work here. We've done some really interesting work in artifact cancellation. So I'm very proud of this work because this kind of came out of nowhere as I was taking a shower one morning. So you don't need to know much about this. Stimulation works as a dipole. So really there's a strong dipole, and this black contour here, let's say this is a saturation contour. Anything below the black contour is saturated, like your amplifier cannot handle this data. It'll just amplify and saturate. It'll come out as a sort of clipped, signal. So we discovered that if you just introduce another auxiliary dipole, given here in purple, with polarity that is exactly the opposite of the primary dipole, and this auxiliary dipole can be as weak as 10% of the primary one, you can actually drive this contour downward. So the black contour can be pushed now, and you can kind of clean up the signal. Let's say you really don't want the top saturated because this is where you're recording from the motor cortex. You can completely sort of free up the motor grid by pushing these contours with a very small auxiliary dipole, so much so you can get almost 30 dB of artifact suppression. So think of this as sort of spatially controlled signal. And then I developed some techniques for sort of array signal processing to take care of these residual artifacts that will still survive, and we can get another 30 to 40 dB of artifact suppression. We've done a lot of COMSOL modeling. So the question is, how much power can you burn in this implant before the tissue starts to heat up and you develop, necrosis and basically, essentially kill the tissue. And so we've built a very detailed model. We even built a prototype. Did not test this in vivo. It's a very difficult. We would really need to do animal studies, but we have a pretty good idea. What in terms of power that can be burned, power budget without causing more than 2 degrees of implant heating, which is what FDA mandates as a safe thermal threshold. So we can estimate about 400 microwatts of power can be burned here. We find that fat is the tissue that undergoes the highest heat delta T when one of these implants is in the chest. We've also collected some data, invasive data. So these are ECOG electrodes implanted in epilepsy patients. So full disclosure, nobody can really, as of yet, implant ECOG to do research. I guess you could, but that would require FDA approval. So currently, ECOG electrodes are approved for epilepsy. And so the easiest way to get a hold of this data is to piggyback on a clinical study. And so we recruit individuals who are undergoing this epilepsy surgery evaluation. There's two types of grids. There's actually more than two, but we use these classical standard grid and this high density eco grid. The standard grid is, there's a 1 centimeter is the electrode pitch. The high density one is much denser. So 4 millimeter is the pitch, much higher density signal, much higher resolution. And so we implanted these over the leg motor cortex. Interestingly, leg motor cortex sits in interhemispheric space. So what you see on the left in participant 1 is the left hemisphere, and what you see in participant 2 is the right hemisphere. So surgically, these are very challenging to put in because you have to go between the two hemispheres. But otherwise, these grids cover largely motor cortex, as evidence here, between precentral sulcus and central sulcus, which is given in green and yellow and green respectively. So, and we've then put these individuals on a treadmill. Mind you, there's cables coming out of the head, they still wear these electrodes. I should say that they spend about a week in a hospital just waiting for seizures to happen so they can localize where the seizures are coming from. But otherwise, they're free to work with us. And so that's why we, again, put them in a harness. They're at increased risk of falling because of epilepsy. And we ask them to walk on a treadmill, and then we ask them to do two types of experiments. One where they just alternate between walking and standing. Another one where they modulate their speed. So this is what a signal from one of the electrodes looks like. So time is here, frequency is here, color is the power at that frequency band. Pink is standing, green is walking. You see this huge, beautiful signature of walking, very clear. You see event-related desynchronization, the beta band, loss of power during walking. And then in the gamma band, which is really broadband from, I would say, 40 and above, you see the opposite. You see power goes up with walking and goes down with standing. So it's beautiful contrast. In EEG, you would probably just see the bottom of this plot. You wouldn't have access to these high frequency data. And this is just one electrode. We have, 10 to 15 electrodes to take advantage of. So here's a video synchronized with the power spectrum or time frequency power distribution. You can kind of predict when she's going to stop. Again, sped up at 4 times the natural speed. So you can predict that there's going to be a stop here just based on signature from this single electrode. So not only can we tell when the person is walking and not walking, we can also tell individual steps. We see these like power bursts at the gamma band that tend to line up more or less 1-to-1 with gyroscope signal. So we should be able to decode both state and step rate or individual steps, and we did. So I'm not going to bore you with details. This is just a standard decoder sort of design, but we are getting very high performance, 99 and above. For reference, in EEG we were able to get about 95% correct, so this is way better. I would argue still not enough probably for actual practical device, because even this error rate is perhaps unacceptable and not safe. We can also decode the step rate, not just the state. And again, we built sort of nonlinear Bayesian decoder that does that very high correlation coefficient in excess of 0.9. But this decoder actually has a massive delay of about 5 seconds. And right now we actually have something better. So I'll definitely update this slide very soon. So in conclusions, we decoded these walking states with unprecedented accuracy, 99.8%, based on a lot of data, about 18 minutes of total data. High correlation, 0.93. Next step would be to integrate this algorithm in a chest wall unit prototype, reverse engineer exoskeleton, which we've done actually, and then test this device in a sort of variable version where the only thing that are implanted are the electrodes and the tunneling cable because they're FDA approved. And then the rest we can take out, and test sort of in a person with spinal cord injury. So how much time do I have, Ed? I have time?
Yeah, sure.
So this will be less detailed. So I just want to tell you the project that's going on in addition to SCI. I mentioned stroke. something I'm really excited about. We do have a clinical trial ongoing, so I will not be able to share too much data because you're not supposed to tamper with that data because the trial is still ongoing. But so foot drop is the leading cause of gait impairment after stroke, inability to dorsiflex as you walk. So it seems like a minor inconvenience, but actually has a profoundly negative impact on gait velocity and also social reintegration of stroke, those who survive stroke. Ankle foot orthoses are mechanical devices that work very robustly because this is a very stereotypical movement, but their benefits disappear upon removal. So as soon as you take the orthosis off, you no longer have that movement, and then it becomes impractical in certain scenarios. So obviously you would want to regain some of that function natively and cast aside all the devices, including ankle foot orthosis. So can BCIs be part of that therapy? Can they be integrated in this sort of loop that lead to permanent neurophysiological gains? So here's a cartoon. We didn't have a good picture of the system, so I actually posed here. Even though my face is blurred, I think you can still recognize. So basically, we record EEG, we send them to system of amplifiers, optically coupled to a computer that does all the data processing. And then the computer decides whether to stimulate the tibialis anterior muscle. And in doing so, the foot will go up. And then obviously the subject receives feedback, right? Because you can feel that action or even electrical stimulation passing through. So the whole system runs in a loop. And then here I'm sort of asked to follow these cues. So I go in, I look at the screen, the cue tells me to stand, to sit still. And then at some point says, tap your foot. So I keep tapping, and then BCI decodes my intention and delivers stimulation. So of course, I don't have stroke. So for me, this is, I kind of have to learn how to do this, but for somebody with stroke, this is one of our subjects that we recruited. So this was her foot dorsiflexion before. You see me struggling actually to pin her heel down, because when you ask somebody with stroke to do certain movement, they'll do a lot of other things to compensate. So it's very hard for them to isolate the movement, but she had almost no dorsiflexion. I think maybe 1 degree was the measured angle. And then after undergoing this quote unquote therapy, I cannot still call it therapy because it's highly experimental, we were able to measure much higher dorsiflexion angle, perhaps 6 or 7 or 8 degrees after doing this for 4 weeks at three times a week, just 1 hour of BCI therapy. So we actually recruited 9 chronic stroke subjects. Chronic means they're at least 6 months post-injury. They were told by their neurologist that they won't regain any function beyond what they've regained. So hence the name chronic. So they've gone through 4 weeks of this therapy. The primary outcome measure was really gait velocity. So this was actually a mini clinical trial. And this was really just a safety trial. We were measuring whether participating in one of these therapies has certain detrimental effects. Does it interfere with everyday life? Does it lead to any maladaptive changes? Because you're messing with muscles and using brain signals. So unlikely that this is damaging, but still formally needed to be tested. Of course, we found that no subject experienced any significant loss of gait velocities. On the contrary, 6 out of 9 actually experienced significant increase in gait velocity. And here you see their sort of weekly progress, gait velocity at the baseline after 1 week of therapy, all the way out to 4 weeks, and then 1 month follow-up. So all 6 subjects, 6 out of 9, have experienced significant increase in gait velocity. Of course, it's an open label study, it's not well controlled. So we cannot claim that this is because of BCI, but I think we have enough evidence to formally pursue this as clinical trial. Even more interesting, in 5 out of those 6, we were actually able to find an EEG biomarker of improvement. So here is something which is, again, you don't have to understand much, which is called event-related synchronization. So it's supposed to be low during dorsiflex and high during idle state. And so here we measured this week by week, and you see that by week 4, the signal became much stronger. The contrast became much stronger. And when we map this to the head, we see that the electrode that experiences the strongest modulation is actually exactly sitting above the foot representation area known as a CZ. So we believe that this might be a biomarker for physiological biomarker for improvement, outcome improvement. And so in conclusion, this therapy appears to be safe. Majority of subjects experience significant increase in gait velocity. There are neurophysiological biomarkers of improvements, and formal clinical trials are justified and necessary. So a little of hypothesis how it works. You know, you have a simultaneous activation of the upper motor neurons coming from the motor cortex. The BCI bypasses the damaged pathway, damage due to a stroke this time, not spinal cord injury. When you stimulate the muscle, these signals, electrical signals, can travel antidromically up the nerve, and then they can meet these descending signals somewhere at the spinal cord. For those of you who are coming from sort of neuroscience background, you know that if two neuronal populations are co-activated, there could be some coupling, increased coupling called Hebbian plasticity mechanism. So we believe that this might be responsible for improvement. And so we were fortunate enough to actually have now phase 2, 2-arm randomized clinical trial, again, started during COVID. So we are surviving and managing to recruit. So subjects are screened and randomized to either experimental group or control group. Of course, we do baseline measurement and assessment. Those in the experimental group will receive 1 hour of BCI FES therapy, followed by 1 hour of standard of care, which is physiotherapy. Those in the control group will just receive 2 hours of physiotherapy. So this is called dose matching, right? And then this intervention will last 4 weeks, and then there will be outcome assessment post-intervention, but also 1 and 3 months out. I should mention that this is blinded, so the assessors are blinded. They don't know whether subjects are coming from experimental or control group. Of course, subjects cannot be blinded, but they can clearly see whether they're wearing EEG or not. So it's not a double blind, it's not possible, but and that's why we're not supposed to tamper with these results. And we just have some anecdotal evidence whether this works or not, but formal proof, we'll have to wait until the trial is finished. I just want to acknowledge my team. Again, this is not the work of one person, my trainees, my former PhD students. Some of them have moved on and have now successful careers outside of my lab. My collaborator is Dr. Ando, who is a neurologist and an important part of my success. Dr. Hidari, who was in charge of these low power circuits and electronics. Dr. Charles Liu, who is a neurosurgeon from USC, responsible for implanting ECOG electrodes and providing intellectual stimulation. Dr. Richard Anderson, who is at Caltech, whose group has been developing these artificial sensation algorithms. My sources of funding, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
This is fantastic, and I have a lot of amateur questions going to ask you. But before I do that, and then I want to remind everyone to please follow us on social media and receive the latest update. And then this is the last seminar this semester. So if you come in next week, we will not be here and there will be no more seminar. But we're also developing something interesting for the next year is we're going to start in the BME department called fireside chat with thought leaders in biomedical engineering. And in June sometime, we're going to start in with a interesting experiment, essentially dual fireside chat. So this side chat, we're not talking about science. It's essentially talking about the things, everything you want to ask in, success leaders, where it was born. No, that's not interesting, how they made it, right? So we're going to start in one with me and our income chair, Paul Scheider. And we do both ways. Paul will ask me about ask a question about me, my experience, and then I will turn around and also ask our income chair, also his plans for our fantastic department. So stay tuned. We have some time for questions. I'm going to pass into my the person really leading this class, Professor Lisa Olson. And the first question I have now is how much really deep learning, machine learning, you incorporate in your studies right now? Is it like will that improve in all the outcome, or do you thinking, I'm thinking you are with humans interface with, machine, but there's a lot of robotics essentially that is robotic trying the machine learning able to learn certain walking, right?
Yeah.
Do you think the combination of learning, let the machine to learn before to really have the person to learn?
Right. Well, I think there's really two questions here. One is, I think, can you use deep learning as a sort of decoder? Because what we do, is ultimately a classifier of some sort. The answer is, of course, yes. We've tried a little bit. I had a student playing with this for a while now, and he was not able to exceed the performance that we see with our classical sort of, information theoretic Bayesian decoder, which doesn't mean that it's not doable. We just haven't been able to exceed the performance. Deep learning does require a lot of data, so the success behind deep learning is really massive amounts of data. That's why, that's why ChatGPT is so powerful, because it has access to pretty much the whole web, even though it's got like billions of parameters, it can still be trained. Of course, you need a server farm to train it, right? So we haven't, short answer, we haven't been able to exceed. And so right now, the complexity of a deep learning system does not justify use for our purpose. Can robots be pre-programmed to do some low-level intelligence? Absolutely. I think, people who are roboticists have been doing this for a while, Robot can be smart, even if your body tells us to crash into this, table. I think robots can avoid the obstacle, figuring out that that's not really what you want to do. So for sure, those are all good questions.
So we're pretty much out of time, but let's see if we have a couple of questions from the audience here. Okay.
Yeah, just have like I think one is pretty clear. For one of them, it has to do with the EEG system. So I know that you've taken into consideration like noise not. So what have you done as far as like the noise that might happen on the signals?
Yeah, so basically, as long as noise happens equally across two classes, then it gets kind of averaged out by machine learning algorithm, so because it's present during both states, and presence of noise, does not affect. Problem would be if there is some noise that's systematically present during, let's say, walking. Let's say I ask you to think about walking, but subconsciously you start like bobbing your head, right? So we kind of take care of those things by instructing subjects not to move, do something, don't blink, more than during one state versus the other. So we haven't had really too much trouble with it. We do have actively shielded electrodes, which are very resistant to motion artifacts. So that certainly helps a lot. And there's always techniques you can throw in to get rid of these obvious artifacts. We didn't have to do it like blinks. Blinks can be eliminated pretty much in real time. As long as you're not blinking disproportionately more frequently during one state, it shouldn't affect the performance. Yes.
And then the other one was has to do with decons.
Yes.
So I guess so. What do you imagine like having both sides of the brain?
Very good question. Yes, the answer is yes, and you're right, because when you implant electrodes on the left motor cortex, that's primarily coming or controlling the right leg in a contralateral fashion. Yes, absolutely, it would have to be bilateral to have sort of full functionality, both sides.
And then maybe we'll see if somebody else has a question. Anybody else have a question here? Or okay, yeah. Let's have that here. Last question before we.
For your talk today, I was wondering if patients. Can you speak up? I was wondering if patients who have never walked before is also applicable for the BCI control.
If they've never walked before, ooh, that's a tough one. I don't know. I have my guess, but that's a very good question. I think that's an important part of success, the ability to recall what you were once able to do. I'm not sure if somebody has been paralyzed from birth, which is, I think, what you're asking. I am not sure, I imagine it will be possible, but it will be maybe a completely different type of physiological signature altogether. That's a great question, by the way.
So why don't we thank our speaker? It's already 5:12. So.
Thank you. Yes.